In this video, I'll show you how to make a lush nano paludarium with not one, but two flowing waterfalls. Stick around to the end as I'm even going to show you how it evolves from day 1 all the way up to day 80. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. What I'll be using is this glass tank that I built myself from picture frame glass. It's got a hinged door and a leveling mat on the bottom. I've shown how to make these tanks plenty of times before, so if you want to learn how, check out the video on screen now. One important feature is this small gap in the top. This will play a key role in the waterfall working properly. The idea I've got for this build isn't just one waterfall, as I think I want two waterfalls on either side of the paludarium. The first thing that I'm doing is placing a foam mat inside the tank, which is going to help protect the glass from the rocks that are about to go inside. The stones I've selected for this build are known as georocks, and they're one of my favourites due to their detailed texture. To add to the hardscape even further, I'm going to use a few pieces of bogwood as well. I'm starting by placing in some georocks to try and create a base that the wood can then go on top of. Despite having a picture in my head, it still takes a whole lot of trial and error to try and make it come to life. After a short while, I think I've achieved something that I like. The left and right piece of wood are going to be where the waterfalls flow down. A few more small pieces of rock will help fill in the gaps around the base and add a bit more detail. As is, the hardscape is very unstable, so I'm going to need to lock it down. As you might have guessed, the easiest and most reliable way of doing this is with the super glue and tissue method. I'm taking a small piece of tissue and wedging it between the wood and rock and then soaking it with some liquid type super glue. It dries really fast and forms a strong and safe bond. With the hardscape nice and solid, it's time to move on to the next step. Instead of placing a pump inside the tank, which would certainly be hard to fit and even harder to clean, I'm going to use an external canister filter. I built this filter myself, and I do have a tutorial on the channel showing you exactly how to make one. I'm going to use these long plastic straws as intake and output pipes inside the paludarium. They both fit perfectly inside the gap that I left in the lid. To start off, I'm going to create the intake as I think it's going to be the easiest. I'm using a sharp blade to cut a notch out the bottom, which will allow it to pull up water. It's certainly not the neatest, but it should work just fine. I'll definitely place in some filter foam around it just to make sure it doesn't get clogged up. As for the top, I think it's going to work much better at a 90-degree angle instead of coming straight out. I'm using some electrical tape to block up one end of the straw. Now I'm going to flip it round and fill the straw up with some fine sand. A small funnel makes this task much easier. Now that the straw's filled up, I'm going to cover the other end with some more tape to lock it all inside. This is a jig that I'm going to use to bend the straw to the correct angle. To bend it, it needs to be heated up, and a lighter is a simple and easy way to do this. I'm doing my best to heat it up very gradually and evenly, as you don't want the flame to burn the plastic. Now that it's nice and soft, I'm going to go ahead and bend it at a 90-degree angle. After holding it in place for about 20 seconds, it's cooled down enough to stay in place. The reason I filled the straw up with sand is because it stops it from collapsing in on itself when bending it. With the tape and sand removed, I can place it inside, and as you can see, it fits in perfectly. Now it's time to work on the output pipe, which is going to be slightly more complicated, especially as I want two waterfalls. Using the exact same methods that I just showed you, I've gone ahead and created all the parts that I think I need. The hole in this straw was created by heating up a screwdriver and simply melting it through. As for attaching these pieces together, I'm going to use these small pieces of silicone tubing. It's all quite fiddly to install, but I've tried to create them in a way that makes them completely invisible once the tank is complete. This is the output for the waterfall on the left, and this small one is the output for the waterfall on the right. I'm expecting the flow on the left to be significantly weaker than the right as it's got a lot more distance to travel, but hopefully it'll make its way out. The only things that need to be attached with glue is the output on the right that goes into the hole in the centre of the straw, and then pinning the output on the left behind the driftwood. I'm really happy with how discreet the pipework is, and once the plants are in, I think it's going to be almost invisible. Before moving on, I want to set up the filter and give the waterfalls a quick test run. I'm using some silicone tubing to attach the filter to the input and output pipes. Now I'm priming the filter by simply filling it up with some water. This is important to do as it won't run if you don't do this. As expected, the left side is significantly weaker than the right, but after some time it did start to even out. It's great to see the filter working just as I planned, and it's super quiet, which is always a plus. Later on, I'll place things in like moss and plants around the outputs to help the water flow down over the wood a bit more naturally. Now that I know the waterfalls are working as they should, let's move on with the build. I'm going to use this sharp blade to cut out the excess foam at the base of the tank. Next, I'm going to place in some filter foam around the intake pipe. This will prevent large objects from being sucked up by the pump, which could potentially block it. I'm also going to use the foam to fill in these gaps in the hardscape. I'm going to be pouring substrate behind the hardscape soon, and if I leave these gaps open, it's simply going to spill into the foreground. For this paludarium, I'm going to try something really simple for the substrate. This is some fine leaker, and it's all I'm going to use for the substrate layer. I've never used it as a standalone substrate before, so I'm really curious to see how it gets on. If it does end up working out, it's going to be a massive win, as this stuff is really quite cheap in comparison to aqua soil, which is what I'll usually use. I'll probably add some more later to cover up the pipework, but for now I'm going to start working on the foreground. I'm starting with just a layer of fine sand. Although it looks better, it certainly doesn't look too natural, so let's fix that by giving it some contrast and detail. I'm starting with some fine gravel and pouring it pretty much everywhere. Next, I'm going to do the same with some small pea gravel, but add slightly less. Finally, I'll add some larger pea gravel, followed by a light dusting of sand to finish it off. Just by adding a bit more variety in stones and gravel, you can see how much more natural it looks. Before I can add any plants, I need to do a couple things. I'm giving the paludarium a really good spray down, and then I'm going to install a black background on the back panel of glass. I think this will help framing the scape much better, as you simply won't be able to see what's behind it. To create a background on a budget, you can simply tape on a black piece of paper. Now I think it's about time to start bringing the paludarium to life with some plants. The first plant going in is Trident fern. I'm mainly going to plant it around the inside and outside of the wood to help hide all the pipework. This, along with all the other plants I'll be using, are sold as aquatic plants, but they grow great inside paludariums due to the high humidity. I'm already loving how it looks, and it's only going to get better and better as I've got plenty more plants to come. Next, I'm going to plant in some Anubias and Bucephalandra. I think the small, delicate leaves of these plants are going to add some nice detail to the paludarium. I can plant the majority of them by wedging them inside gaps and cracks, but for the ones that I can't, I'm using a small amount of gel type superglue. These types of plants are prone to drying out, so keeping them damp really is essential. The next plant to go in is this crypt. I'm going to plant it into the leaker right in the centre. This plant is quite demanding of nutrients, so it's going to be interesting to see how it gets on with no real substrate. To fill in more of the background, I'm going to plant in some hygrophila. I absolutely love the unique detail in this plant's leaves, and I think it adds a natural look to whatever scape it goes in. I've still got a few plants to add, but before doing so, I'm going to fill the tank up with water. Just like always, I'm placing a small piece of paper towel inside the tank to stop the water disrupting the sand or scape too much. I'm not using any fancy water, and it's just regular tap water that's been dechlorinated. To bring a bit more detail to the water's surface, I'm going to place in some floating plants. I think a couple different species varying in size and texture always adds a more natural look. Now let's install the filter and get the waterfalls running before adding any moss. Right at the top of the intake, I'm adding a small amount of filter wool to help polish the water. It's working great, but as I said earlier, I want the water to flow down over the wood a bit more naturally. Adding moss is a super easy way to manipulate the flow of the water. I'm adding small patches of this Christmas moss around the output pipes, and as you can see, it drastically changes the flow. Before leaving the Paludarium to grow in, I'm going to add some springtails. These tiny bugs will help keep the ecosystem clean and healthy by eating things like mould and decaying matter. Now all that's left to do is to close the hinged door and leave the Paludarium to grow in and establish. It's been just under 3 months since I set this nano Paludarium up, and I'm glad to say that it's thriving. To my surprise, all the plants are doing unbelievably well. I was half expecting to see some nutrient deficiencies by now, but as you can see, that's simply not the case. I definitely need to do a bit more experimentation with this substrate method, as these results are really quite promising. As for the waterfalls, they're both still flowing perfectly, and I really love watching these slow drips over on the left side. Now let's take a look under the water, as things are slightly different than I expected. As I'm sure you can tell, the water's got a bit of coloration to it. The reason for this coloration is simply because the bogwood is slowly leaching tannins into the water. I could fix it by simply doing more water changes or even adding some carbon to the filter, but to be honest, I really like how natural it makes the tank look. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you look closely, you might be able to see some life inhabiting the water. A couple weeks ago, I added a small group of tiny baby cherry shrimp. They're all doing really well, and despite their small size, they have grown significantly since I introduced them, which I'm guessing is due to the abundance of food. I doubt I'll keep them in here once they're fully grown, as it might be a bit small, but it's going to serve as a great grow out tank. As for the external filter, there's no issues to report whatsoever. It's still working just as it was on day one, but it might need a slight clean soon. Other than general maintenance such as cleaning the glass, I really haven't done too much at all. Believe it or not, I've only done 2 water changes in the past 80 days. I do think this has played a key role in the success of the Paludarium, as it's kept all the parameters nice and stable. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this build in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out this one next, as I think you might enjoy it too.